And he was a toughie, he was a Green Beret. Um, and he just started to weep, started to cry. He told me that he'd lost his whole platoon.
Ian Anderson talking about the horrors of war. Not exactly the most uplifting thing for a rock channel, but it's part of a long conversation. The longest interview out of, I think, 8 interviews that I've done with Ian through the years, where you can tell when Ian's engaged. He sits up. He's a shy guy, and PR is not his main thing. Not his fault. It's just a thing that artists have to do. It doesn't mean they want to do it. But you can tell when he's engaged and he's really interested in a topic. He looks up and he looks at the camera. Again, nothing personal, but it's a subject that's touching to him. And he had a personal experience with a Green Beret soldier. In this clip, we're going to talk about the fact that his rock and roll lifestyle was not his first choice, it was his third. And we'll have clips from his explanation on some of the most classic Jethro Tull hits of all time, with older clips that we haven't shared in quite a long time with Ian Anderson. So, first, we talk about war, which is something that is very topical these days. And then some classic albums and songs from Ian Anderson on Rock History Music. Once before he died, I talked to one of my best friend's dad who fought on the German side of the, and he looked at me and he says, "Well, he says, listen, I've killed people. I feel bad about that, but he says, if you didn't do that, if you didn't fight, that would not be good for the family. You know, you had to go in." And I remember going, I felt stupid when I went, "Oh, well, of course, that happens in every side, in every war." And
That's right. And people have to try and reconcile the horrors of war with their own private sense of guilt, of righteousness, of however they feel about it. And it's not easy. And most of the veterans I've spoken to, some of whom have been psychologically or physically damaged, that's the thing that really stands out, is that it's a chapter of their lives that will never close. That book will never close. I remember doing some firearm training with with one of the special forces who'd been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he gave me his personal Glock pistol, 10 millimeter round, unusually because they're usually 9 millimeter, but this was a 10 millimeter special, and he let me shoot. He wanted me to shoot his gun, and I was very honored by the fact that he wanted me to use his weapon in this Navy SEALs training place. And I asked him, have you you've been on active service. I mean, you've had to do this for real, not just shooting at an animated huge video wall of with live ammunition. You know, however realistic that might be, rather like a flight simulator at British Airways headquarters. You're flying a Boeing 777 or whatever it might be. It's the real thing. It's not a mock-up. It's the real deal. And you're in such a super realistic environment. And it's the same thing when you're training for whether it's special forces or SWAT teams, police forces, whatever. You are training in a very realistic environment. But doing the real thing. When I had spoke to this guy about it, and he was a toughie, he was a Green Beret, and he just started to weep, started to cry. He told me that he'd lost his whole platoon as a platoon leader. He'd lost all of them in one particular gun battle, and and he wept when I gave him his gun back when he didn't shoot himself. But he was, he was overcome seriously by the horrors of what he'd done, and yet still felt that it was his role in his post-military career to train other people to do that same thing. But the emotional weight that he had to bear for and will bear for the rest of his life is something that we can't understand. We haven't had to do that. So that's why, I have a huge respect for the military forces and indeed for policemen. My first career choice was to be a policeman. And
really,
I was, deadly serious about being a cop, being a good cop. I've studied quite diligently the whole career path through the police force, and I really wanted to do that. And I went for an interview, and they turned me down because I had too many exam qualifications. They mistrusted my motives, that I was running away from something to join the police force. In a sense, I was. I was running away from school because I didn't want to go on in that academic world. I wanted to, I wanted to get my hands dirty, so to speak, and do something to train for a career that wasn't strictly academic. So, but I got turned down. And my second career choice was to be a journalist. And I went for an interview with a local newspaper. They turned me down as well.
You would have been a
And
great
so
journalist.
I know. Well, the thing is, I ended up with career choice number three. It was number three on my list was international rock star. I ended up having to do that.
Thick as a Brick turns 50 this year. What's the box set going to look like?
Well, Thick as a Brick was amply dispatched at the age of 40 in terms of box sets and so on, with Thick as a Brick being remixed by Stephen Wilson, and the subsequent Thick as a Brick 2 in 2012. They were bundled together as a big box set. More than that, I can't do, because Thick as a Brick was written as a project with that music only. There are no outtakes. There are no additional songs or parts. It is what it is. It is. And back then, of course, there were no live performances that were recorded. So I'm afraid if Thick as a Brick 50th anniversary, you've just got to go back and with a big Sharpie and put a 5 where the 4 used to be.
There's a lot of genres going on. I remember someone coming to my house when I was a kid, and someone said, "This is the most complex music I've ever heard. There's like every genre in the world being played on this album." What was your approach to that, to putting that together?
Well, I wasn't really thinking about anything other than the last 3 minutes of music that I'd written, because I would, when we were working on the album, I would write 3 minutes of music in the morning, and then go to meet the other guys in the band in the afternoon, and we would rehearse the new stuff and add it on to what we did the day before, and we gradually built up an album. But it was a very organic growth. We would recap on what we'd done as we went along, so there was some direction that I could apply perhaps the following morning when I went to write the next few minutes. But it wasn't really in my head to try and give it any particular shape or otherwise. The underlying notion was music that was, or rather lyrics that were written by an 8-year-old precocious schoolboy learning to cope with being a child in an adult world, and coping with some of the stereotypes and prejudices that you face, and are a little confusing, perhaps, as a child, and maybe even for a lot of people when they get much older. But that was the underlying essence, the concept of the album, and it was done in a tongue-in-cheek, spoof kind of a way. It was a parody of concept albums of the era, dressed up in a packaging that was a 16-page newspaper, which was a parody of a provincial small-town newspaper in the UK. I was hopeful that people would accept it, they would get it, and I think that the answer is that 50% of the people understood exactly what I was getting at, and the comedic aspect of it. The other 50% didn't get it, but that was pretty good, because I rather like the idea that you could be on stage and half the people are scratching their heads thinking, what? And the other half are going, yeah, I love that. It's somehow more gratifying than having everybody feel the same way about it. So I think a degree of puzzlement and curiosity is part of what makes it ultimately more enjoyable. If you have to think twice or 3 times or 4 times about it to grasp finally what it might mean for you, which is probably still different to what it means to me in terms of the lyrical references. That you can never know what's really in the writer's mind with pop lyrics or rock lyrics. It's a degree of abstracts in there that I think is what makes it attractive.
Where'd you come up with the name? Was Gerald Bostock based on anybody? Where'd you come up with that?
He was based perhaps a little bit on me, but also a bit on other children that I went to school with, who were those that were the more serious and studious children, who were never very popular. They were tending to be bullied. They weren't good at sports. They were, so there's an element really of, it's not a single person. It's just, to some extent, speaking from my own personal memory of being a child, and other people that I saw around me. And I tend, being an observational writer, I tend usually to adopt more from other people. I don't usually use my own emotions or my own experiences directly in writing a song. My experiences of seeing a particular topic, of course, I'm working within the terms of that, but I'm not usually talking about my own emotions or my own historical life events. That's rare that I ever do that. I'm mostly an observer of other people in a landscape, rather like a painter, rather like a Manet. I'm not really I'm not a landscape painter, and I'm not a portrait painter. I like to see people in a context and see what they're doing, where they are, and that's my visual reference, really. So songs are very often about they're never really close-ups of people.
Are you? Having said that, are you a people watcher? When you go someplace, do you study people, or is this been like when I was a kid? I did that, and I still do that. I'm just curious.
Yeah, and that's why one of the reasons I like to travel alone and use public transport where I can, because I find it more enjoyable to be alone and able to use my eyes and look out of a window. So I'm more likely to be sitting on a train. Certainly, you won't find me in a tour bus traveling at night. That would be hell. And I'm not very keen on being in an airplane either, because I'm not a happy flyer. But, on the ground, I prefer really to be in the train. I manage to do that to some extent when always when I'm in the UK, but sometimes in Europe, I'm traveling between towns or even between countries using the public train services.
But don't a lot of people, they know your face though. Don't people bug you?
No, they don't, because they might stop and think, oh, that guy sitting over there, and that, he reminds me of somebody. I can't think who it is, but they don't expect to see you in that context. So if you're on a bus, or on a train, people are not going to be, necessarily looking at you. That you're just another faceless person in the crowd. On the other hand, if you arrive at an international airport, then it's hard to escape. If people know that you're coming to do a tour, there's going to be some fans there, and that's they spot you immediately, even if you're wearing a face mask and with a hat over your head. They still recognize you some way. From my experience in the last few months, that is still the case.
Have fans ever?
Then they expect to see you there. They expect to see you, so they do.
Marcus Westermark asks, all these are all your fans. Do you still do salmon farming?
No. For 20 years, I was very actively engaged in aquaculture and fish processing. And I decided, apart from the financial risk, which was really considerable, I felt uncomfortable increasingly about environmental aspects of salmonid farming, because mainly because of the issues of sourcing feed. It meant as salmon farming became more and more popular and industrial in its nature, more and more millions of tons of fish species were being hoovered up from the ocean in order to turn into high protein fish dry feed for salmon. And to turn a lowly form of fish protein into a higher value of fish protein, increasingly became uncomfortable for me. And although there were beginnings of movements towards trying to get salmon to go vegan, to eat essentially a vegetarian protein diet, they were not successful. As it happens right now, about 50%, or maybe even a little more than 50%, is actually vegetable matter that finally now it is palatable enough to be able to feed to salmon. Trout, on the other hand, they would always take a healthy admixture of vegetable matter in their feed. And some fish like carp, for example, are naturally vegan. They just are. They eat nothing but vegetables. Toss in a dead sheep, they're not going to go near it. So that was one of the problems. I think the other environmental issues to do with chemicals was something that's, to a large extent, you could avoid and can avoid to this day. So I wouldn't worry about that one. And in terms of the visual aspect of salmon farms, producing a visual pollution in the landscape in remote idyllic highland lochs, there's something again. You can't ever make that look pretty. They are very visible, and that's the end of it. But I was always in favor of shellfish farming, and I still am today. If I had remained in aquaculture, it would have been farming mussels and scallops and oysters. In other words, the bivalves, because you just put the little guys into the water, and they get bigger because they naturally ingest plankton, which is there as a freebie. So that they don't pollute, they don't do anything. And generally speaking, because they're growing below the surface, there's very little to see on the surface of the water. So a very good reason for sticking with bivalve aquaculture. It's just that having got out of it, I got out of it. And that's the end of it, not going back. I have my rest of my remaining days as a as a farmer of grass and trees. That's all I do.
Yeah, and locomotive breath, was that really about overpopulation?
Yes. Yes, it was about population growth, but it was talking about what we might now call globalization, so that it is population and its place in the expanding capitalist world that we live in, and it might have seemed back then a difficult subject, and it's a difficult subject today. People don't like to be reminded of the harsh reality of overpopulation, and we everything follows on from that. Everything from the pandemic crisis we're in, you can trace that back to the effect of huge population, the travel, the spread of the disease, everything to do with climate change. You can see how that is vastly exacerbated by population size. So pretty much everything that we might fear and be concerned with in terms of its effect on our great-grandchildren and their world to come is linked to population size of planet Earth. I mean, it was observed many, many years ago that probably the optimum population would be somewhere between 2 and 3 billion if we were to find a truly sustainable, workable place in the environment. And even that would depend on the miracles of modern science coming to bail us out of the trouble we get into. But it should be a sobering reality when you consider that when I was born in 1947, the population of planet Earth was, a moderate one. It was kind of looking probably a little heating up, but okay. And if you ask people, well, by how much in my lifetime do you think the population of Earth has grown? They might say, 50%. Mm-hmm. Some bullish people might say, 100%. It's probably doubled. I mean, they should be quite shocked to hear that it's actually slightly more than 3 times now what it was when I was born. So in one person's lifetime, we have seen a tripling of our population. And although there are many signs that in many countries that population growth has reversed into a slight decline, and that's the case in most European countries where the fertility rate is down around 1.6 per fertile female. Mm-hmm. And that's that would result in a slight decline in population over the next 100 years. We would be heading in the right direction. But of course, in other countries, it's still up around 5 or 6 per fertile female. And at that point, because that is occurring in countries perhaps in many cases least able to support population growth, especially in the context of climate change, that's what will result in incredible pressure for migration from people in particularly Africa and parts of Asia to areas such as yours or mine. And we have to learn how to deal with that vast level of pressure for immigration from people who simply are born into a world that or into a national context, that they cannot support them. It will make today's world, with a couple of thousand people crossing the English Channel to seek refuge in the UK illegally, or a few thousand people swimming across a river in Texas from Mexico, it will make that look, hey, what were we worried about back then? That's just a trickle. We really have to face up to enormous changes, and that's what I'm trying to say in that song is, we are on this seemingly lemming-like suicide mission in terms of an unstoppable force that we seem incapable of dealing with, and we don't even want to talk about it because no one likes to be told how many children they can or cannot have.
Yeah.
But I think it is a personal responsibility that people should be aware that they can make. And when in educated Western world society, where women who are educated have a degree of choice in what happens to them, then they very often are choosing to have smaller families, 1 or 2 children, or sometimes none at all. Hence the reduction in population in Europe. But that's not the case in your country, and it's certainly not the case in the African countries, for example. And it would be a hot potato if someone was to try and tell the American public, maybe you should think about just having 1 or 2 children. I mean, you can imagine that would be even worse than taking their guns away.
Yeah. Well, you were we touched on this. Like Aqualung, the song itself, is it about treatment of the homeless population? Was that?
It's really more about our reaction to the homeless, the embarrassment, the sense of, in some cases, hopelessness, of tragedy, of sadness, but also a degree of fear, a degree of discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
We have very mixed emotions in regard to a lot of things about which we could be charitable. And I think the song is, for me, more about our reaction to the homeless rather than specifically going into the detail of the homeless themselves, which would be presumptuous on my part, perhaps because I've been in that situation. It wouldn't be as disingenuous for me to write about being homeless, perhaps, as it would be for me to write about picking cotton in the Mississippi belt in the early 1900s, and painting my face black and pretending to be an authentic Black American blues singer. It would be some stuff you just have to stand back and say, I can't do that. That's just, that would not be right coming from me. And so I have to fall short sometimes of writing in a way that I think I can't be authoritative because I can't really know how somebody feels. I do write songs in the first person,
yeah,
but they're not me. They are about a character that I've invented, and I am inventing that persona and inhabiting that as a writer would, as a screenwriter would write lines to be acted out by an actor. So sometimes that's part of the way I write songs, and therefore you shouldn't always assume that just because I say I and me in a song that what is being said is actually my own personal true inner belief or sentiment.
Remember, if you want to make a donation to the channel, there is a link at the very top of our description. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and click that bell notification so you don't miss anything, because for whatever reason, YouTube's not letting everyone know when we have a new video. And keep checking back on the channel. Also in the description, we have a list of our top 10 previous videos, the ones that have done incredibly well, which we think you'll be interested in. Click on those, or even go on the channel and click on older videos. The majority of what we do is interviews. Share our videos on social media, comment on them, and like them. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Music. Take care of yourself.